like this, where you could actually move the floor of the jar up and down. And in doing so, change the volume of the container. Okay? And he found that if you put a certain quantity of gas into a container, okay, and at a stable temperature, you kept that gas at a stable temperature, then if you change the volume of that container, let's say you have the volume, you move the floor up to here, okay? Then as you decrease volume, what happens to the pressure within that container?
Increasing.
Yeah, it increased. So there was an inverse relationship between volume and pressure. And it makes sense because pressure is created by molecular collisions. Pressure is created by one molecule bouncing off another or bouncing off the wall of the container. These constant collisions create pressure. And if you decrease the volume of a container, you're going to place molecules in closer proximity to each other, and so there are going to be more collisions. Okay? So there's an inverse relationship that exists between pressure and volume such that the product of pressure and volume remains constant. Again, if you have the same quantity of gas at the same temperature. Here's what I mean. Let's suppose that this volume is 1 liter, and the gas that I've placed in that volume creates an atmosphere of pressure. So I can take the product of pressure, atmospheres, times volume, and if I change the volume, let's say now the volume is half of what it is here, 0.5 liters, then then I can solve for the new pressure. Okay. I can isolate P2, and it comes out to what? 2 atmospheres. So if I have volume, I double pressure. That makes sense. The reason we're talking about this is because this is what occurs within your thoracic cavity and lungs when you breathe. Okay. Our lungs are open to the outside atmosphere. So whatever pressure exists in this outside atmosphere is the same pressure that exists within our lungs. That's referred to as the intrapulmonary pressure. Okay. If I expand my lungs, then I suddenly drop the intrapulmonary pressure in relationship to atmosphere. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. If I increase the volume of my lungs, then the pressure inside is going to transiently fall below atmospheric pressure. Okay? And of course, that pressure gradient, that difference in pressure between atmosphere and the lungs, is what drives airflow. It's very analogous to what we discussed with regard to blood flow. Blood flows from an area of higher pressure into an area of lower pressure. Same thing happens within our lungs. As we expand the lungs and we drop the pressure inside, then we create a pressure gradient between the atmosphere and the lungs. And that pressure gradient is what drives airflow. So when we expand the lungs, air comes in. Okay? When we decrease the volume of our lungs like this, we increase the intrapulmonary pressure, such that now it's higher than atmospheric pressure. And because of the open communication between the lungs and the atmosphere, then that pressure gradient drives air out. Okay? So inspiration and expiration are dependent upon pressure gradients. Does everyone get that? Everyone follow? If you don't, then just ask. Okay. I brought this little bell jaw here to demonstrate. Here's a bell jaw these balloons are actually connected to atmospheric pressure through that little hole there. And what it shows here is you can think of this area outside the balloons, between the balloons and this glass bell jar, as being the pleural space. Okay? And so as I expand the pleural volume like this, what I'm doing is I'm decreasing pressure in the interpleural space. I'm creating a more negative pressure, which acts like a suction. It in turn expands the balloons, and the pressure within the balloons drops, and that pulls air in. So let's try this again. See what's happening? Mm-hmm. Same principle as breathing. Okay? You can think of this floor of the bell jar as being the diaphragm. When we take a breath in, we lower the diaphragm. Okay? And that's going to cause expansion of the pleural cavity. So the pressure within the pleural cavity falls, it becomes more negative. And there's a saying in physics, which is that negative pressure sucks. Okay? So that negative pressure acts upon the lungs and causes then subsequent expansion of the lungs, in this case the balloons. And as you expand the volume of the balloon, the pressure inside falls and sucks in air from the atmosphere. So that's why as you pull down on the floor of the bell jar, the balloons expand. Now, as you increase intrapleural pressure, okay, that puts more pressure on the balloons, the lungs, causing them to get smaller, collapse, increasing intrapulmonary pressure, which drives air out. We're going to take it one step at a time. But that's the basis for ventilation. Now, if I say this, if I say that inspiration is an active process, what does that mean? If I say inspiration is an active process, it requires energy. Whereas expiration is passive. And the reason that is because when you take a breath in, you're contracting the muscles of the diaphragm and the external intercostal muscles. That requires energy. On the other hand, with expiration, you're simply relaxing those two sets of muscles. So inspiration is an active process, whereas expiration typically, at least at rest, is passive. What is the main muscle of inspiration? That's the diaphragm. But it's assisted by the external intercostals. You learned about these in A&P 1. Let's see. Get this thing going. Does that make a noise? Oh, that's outside.
That's making noise.
Okay.
I think it might be the fan inside.
What's that?
The fan inside.
Okay.
To make it cool.
Right. You know, I don't see it coming on now. It's always disturbing. I'll start the picture. Change?
Like the same one. Yeah. You ever get up or something?
It's green now, huh? Or is it orange? You said
Orange. It's orange and green.
All right, let's see if it changes. Hold on. If I do, oh wait, it's coming on.
Yeah.
Is it close one?
Well, I can go old school, but I hate to do it. It's not as efficient.
Wait, no, let me check here.
No, it's still on, but. Hold on. Okay, we're good. Okay. So what we see here is these are the external intercostal muscles. The external intercostals have fibers that run in this direction, as if your hands are in your pockets. Okay? They originate from the rib above and insert upon the rib below, such that when they contract, they raise the lower rib up like this, like the handle of a bucket. Okay? Just like the handle of a bucket, when you raise it, it increases the area subtended by that handle. So that as the ribs are raised, they expand the lungs. They expand, not the lungs, but the thoracic cage. Okay? Particularly in the anterior and posterior direction, but also to a small extent laterally. The diaphragm, on the other hand, the diaphragms, when you contract them, they move downward. So that's going to result in an increase in the height of the thoracic cavity, which also serves to increase volume. So these are the two muscles that are used during quiet inspiration, the external intercostals and the diaphragm. And when you contract these muscles, they expand the intrathoracic space, which is going to lead to an expansion of the lungs as well. Now, what this picture demonstrates is accessory muscles of inspiration and expiration. During quiet breathing, the only two muscles that we use when you're sitting there at your workspace is the diaphragm and external intercostals. But let's suppose you were struggling to move air. Okay? Then you might have to incorporate additional muscles to try to expand your thorax even more, to increase the room for the lungs to expand, to create a greater gradient, to improve airflow. Okay, so what are those accessory muscles? Sternocleidomastoid is one. The scalenes, which sit deep to the sternocleidomastoid, that's the second group. And third, pectoralis minor. So when you contract the sternocleidomastoid, you're lifting up on the sternum even more. You're expanding the thoracic cavity to an even greater extent. Same thing with the scalenes, which attach to the ribs. And of course, you know that the pectoralis minor inserts the ribs 3, 4, and 5. So when it contracts, it pulls up on those ribs even more. So although we don't use these muscles during quiet breathing, if you're struggling to breathe, okay, or you want to move more air, okay, you do so by creating a greater gradient, okay, by increasing the volume during inspiration even more, okay, that's going to reduce pressure within the lungs, which in turn is going to drive more airflow. So those three sets of muscles are the accessory muscles of inspiration. Now, we said that expiration is a passive process. We just relax the diaphragm and external intercostals. But sometimes we have to forcibly push air out. For instance, if we have an asthma attack, okay, and the airways undergo bronchospasm, they're narrowed, that's going to interfere with the movement of air out. And so then we have to generate even more pressure within the lungs to push that air out. That would be the case, for instance, if a kid comes into the pediatric ER struggling to move air because of asthma, because of bronchospasm. He's going to incorporate accessory muscles of expiration as well. The accessory muscles of expiration are the internal intercostals. Okay? These muscles typically sit deep to the external intercostals, and their fibers run in the opposite direction. They originate from the rib below and insert upon the rib above, such that when these muscles contract, they pull the ribs down. And in doing so, they decrease the intrathoracic volume. They compress the lungs. Of course, if you make the lungs smaller, you increase intrapulmonary pressure, and that's going to drive air out. The other accessory muscles of respiration are all of the abdominal muscles. The rectus abdominis, external obliques, internal obliques, and transversus abdominis. When you contract these muscles, what does it do? They push in on the abdomen. Okay? They increase intra-abdominal pressure, which pushes up on the diaphragm. So contraction of the abdominal muscles increases intra-abdominal pressure, pushing up on the diaphragm. And as the diaphragm is pushed back up into the thoracic cavity, it ultimately ends up causing compression of the lungs and increasing intrapulmonary pressure, which drives air out. All right, so you'll be expected to know the muscles used during quiet breathing, and then the accessory muscles of both inspiration and expiration. You know that with regard to breathing, if a child develops bronchospasm, do you think that affects inspiration or expiration more?
Inspiration.
It's expiration. Yeah, and this is the reason. Right, let's say this is an airway, and at the end of it is an alveolus, an air sac. And let's suppose, because of asthma, they develop bronchospasm where this airway narrows. Okay? As they pull air into this air sac, okay, this is a closed-ended sac, pressure builds up, and this buildup in pressure tends to stint the airway open.